Hi, welcome back. My name is James McConnell, and on this channel, among many things, I am fascinated with potential new propulsion systems. And so what I'm going to be doing for this video and for a few others is we're going to actually be following up on some patents that I've been investigating today. So let's get into this right out of the gate. What I've got set up is been going through patents.google.com, trying to find any patents that seem to be related to unconventional spacecraft propulsion or anything of that nature, gravity manipulation, electrogravitics, the work of T.T. Brown and others, and trying to kind of track that. And what I've done is I've actually found a couple patents that are pretty interesting, and we're going to be breaking each of these down in their own respective videos. And what we'll do is we're going to be starting with the first one by this inventor for this video today, and then we'll be continuing to discuss his other two patents as well. He does have a fourth patent, which is for something that seems to be different, but we'll probably get to that one last as well. And that would be the device with multiple selectable less lethal options. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen, and we can get going. All right, so what I have is I have the Google patent page for the inventor James Wayne Purvis. Now, as I stated, I've basically just been kind of scouring patents.google to try to find anything that's of interest, and then ultimately would be interested in actually speaking to these individuals personally and potentially even having them on the show if possible. To speak to this particular situation, I did actually manage to speak to James, and he's not comfortable speaking about this yet, but perhaps in the future he will be. So we're going to get the next best thing, which is me trying to understand his work and break it down for you. And, I'm definitely a layman to these kinds of concepts. I don't have a technical background, but what I do have is a curiosity and an interest to try to learn more and to try to share what I'm learning with other people. And so that's what we're going to do. We have a couple patents. And like I said, we'll start with the very first one that he released, granted in 2018, the second one being granted in 2019, or excuse me, the second one here being granted in 2019 and this other one being granted in 2018 as well. But we'll start with the capacitive-discharge electromagnetic propulsion system. So just looking straight through at the highlights here on the homepage, the abstract, the present invention discloses an apparatus and method for electromagnetic spacecraft propulsion. The apparatus includes capacitor assemblies bracketed by electromagnetic solenoids configured in Helmholtz coil geometries. The action of magnetic fields generated in the solenoids on segmented currents in conductive discharge elements during capacitor discharge produces unidirectional forces. While reaction momentum is carried away by the Poynting vector electromagnetic fields in conformity with the currently understood principles of electrodynamics. I think that's important because nobody is saying that we need to throw out all of physics or necessarily much of physics, but perhaps we need to interpret it in new ways. And I think that's what people like Sal Pies are doing, and this gentleman as well. All right, so I want to just showcase a couple of the images first and foremost. Of course, these aren't going to mean a whole lot to us until we actually dig into the details. But we've got this first image, the second image here, seeming to be if you think about the right-hand rule with electromagnetism, perhaps this has some relationship. Not really sure yet. This is an interesting diagram as well, showing some sort of a circuit. Similarly, some sort of a circuit. And then finally, this seems to be perhaps sort of a higher level view of the system itself, as opposed to these more in-depth circuit diagrams. Hopefully we'll get more into that as we go forwards. A couple other key notes before we actually download the document and look into it. So filed in 2016, ultimately granted and published in 2018 with an expiration of 2036. Below is a couple of interesting things that we should note. So the field of this invention, the present invention discloses an apparatus and method for electromagnetic spacecraft propulsion. In particular, thrust is generated without the expulsion of reaction mass. That's key. This unique system and method is comprised of a capacitor assemblies with discharge elements and electromagnetic coils. A unidirectional Lorentz force is generated by the magnetic fields from the coils acting on the segmented current in the discharge element during the capacitor discharge. So basically, that's the abstract. What I think is key, though, is the background for this, because we're going to see that this gentleman, James, did not necessarily create these ideas out of thin air, but worked from previously understood patents in physics, various people who we're going to get to talk about on this show as well. Background to the invention. One of the most significant metrics for spacecraft propulsion systems is a specific impulse, which is the ratio of thrust produced to the rate of propellant consumed. Specific impulse is in the rate of seconds and is essentially the number of seconds that a pound of propellant will produce a pound of thrust. The higher the specific impulse, the less propellant needed. So we don't want to have a bunch of jet fuel that we have to take into space because that's heavy and ultimately it's just going to go away once we're actually done using that. We want something that we flip a switch, creates force. I'm not sure how exactly we get there yet, but we don't have propellant, we don't have fuel in the same traditional context. The Stafford synthesis group concludes that future space exploration will require advanced propulsion technologies. That's a no-brainer. Subsequently, NASA provided the Breakthrough Propulsion Physics Program, one of the three main goals of which was to discover new propulsion methods that eliminate or dramatically reduce the need for propellant. This implies discovering fundamentally new ways to create motion, presumably by manipulating inertia, gravity, or by any other interactions between matter, fields, and space-time. Therefore, an electromagnetic spacecraft propulsion system, such as the present invention, does not require expendable propellant and thus has an effectively infinite specific impulse. This would address needs for spacecraft propulsion and greatly reduce costs. A little bit more on the background. Sir Isaac Newton's well-known third law of motion states every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, or the mutual action of two bodies upon each other are always equal and directed on contrary parts. This has been interpreted as an all-encompassing paradigm for well over 300 years. The Newtonian interpretation excluded the possibility of reactionless propulsion of a solid body. However, the discovery of electricity and magnetism, the new branch of electrodynamics resulting from Maxwell's equations, and the subsequent rise of real relativistic electrodynamics and quantum electrodynamics lead to a new interpretation of the famous third law of motion. So I'm going to do my best here to kind of understand what that means. And I think what that's saying is that if we consider the possibility that in a particular box, there's perhaps a conservation of momentum or a conservation of energy, or in the case of the third law, within a particular system, there's always an equal and opposite reaction. I think what's being considered nowadays, and if you have other thoughts in the comments, please let me know, would be that perhaps the system that we're considering or the box that we're working in needs to be expanded. So we're not necessarily working in a closed system the way that we've considered, i.e., think outside the box. All right. One of the important characteristics of an electromagnetic wave is that it can transport energy from point to point. The rate of energy flow per unit area in a plane electromagnetic wave is described by the Poynting vector S, which we're going to showcase some equations here, and they're basic, so don't worry. Poynting vector S defined as the cross product of the instantaneous E field, which is the electric field, and the B field, magnetic field, comprising the EM wave. So that's the electromagnetic wave. The direction of S gives the direction in which the energy moves. So that's kind of your right-hand rule type of thing. So if we actually go to this page here, Poynting vector, usually denoted by S or N. And if you look at some images, as I stated, these do have some reminiscence to some of the graphs or images that we saw within the patent as well. You can see basically, for those that aren't aware, what you have is an electric field and a magnetic field, which have a perpendicular axes. And then through that, that's where you're going to be seeing your force. And once again, I am definitely not a pro at any of this. I'm just trying to break this down as best as I can. And so this is a fluid process, and I'm always open to criticism, and I'm always definitely trying to get better. So I want any insight from folks who may have other thoughts as well. Okay, so continuing on, less familiar than the S field's direction in which it moves is the fact that the EM wave also transports linear momentum. Just as Poincare noted in 1900, Stebbins explains that the electromagnetic field closely resembles a relativistic fluid composed of quantum particles, photons, which transmit properties and respond to forces in much the same way as a Eulerian fluid. This is from Stebbins' Forces on Fields. In electromagnetism, as in Newton's solid body mechanics, the force on matter from electromagnetic fields is balanced by an equal and opposite force from matter on the field. Stebbins presents an excellent proof which can be derived from Maxwell's equations and the Lorentz force law. The proof relates the reaction momentum change of the electromagnetic field to the time rate of change of the Poynting vector. The divergence of the Maxwell stress tensor and Einstein's relativistic mass-energy relations. Straightforward application of the Boyd-Savart law from classical physics shows that the magnetic field from a rectangular conducting coil acting on an isolated current segment generates a unidirectional force on the coil system. So this is kind of going back to what I keep kind of hearing and thinking about, which is this concept of geometries of coils. And ultimately, the coil is more or less just a conduit for us to create this electromagnetic field and particular relationships between coils potentially generating novel effects. I think that's what is being described here, but just doing my best to understand it. By recognizing that the electromagnetic fields can transport both energy and momentum, apparent violations of the third law are mathematically resolved by including modern field transport physics in the analysis of the reaction process. I'm not going to go through this entire part here, but we just wanted to note that piece on the geometry of coils. And we're also going to be getting into a couple of the other items down here as well, and then digging into the paper itself. Before I do that, though, I want to note what's claimed in this patent. We've heard some of this already. A method for closing the apparatus of Claim 1 comprising the steps of closing electrical switches to connect a voltage source to the conductive plates of the capacitor assemblies, so to charge the capacitor assemblies to a desired voltage, opening electrical switches to disconnect the said voltage, closing switches. All right. So let's keep going a little bit down. I think we have a good understanding of what's being claimed. Essentially, what's being claimed is that through a different understanding of known physics, there is the possibility to produce a unidirectional Lorentz force, which could be a way of or a form of propulsion for whatever craft is utilizing this technology. Nobel laureate Richard Feynman, among others, notes that the magnetic interaction between two charged particles moving orthogonally to each other apparently does not satisfy NTL in classical Newtonian dynamics. But as Feynman explains, if the changing momentum of the electromagnetic fields of the two particles is included, then overall momentum is conserved. Engineering exploitation of this situation to date has not been effective due to the circuit completion problem. While isolated moving changes may apparently violate NTL, when they are confined as part of a complete closed circuit, then by application of Gauss's law, the net forces on each circuit are found to be equal and opposite in accordance with NTL. This is a key section, and we'll get to some of the details in the table in a moment. So what this table presents is a comparison of experimental results for several propellantless propulsion devices. So there's other people that have developed similar technologies, and I think that's key because this isn't coming out of thin air. Once again, this is built on a history nearly potentially well over 100 years old and has been something that's been whether intentionally or unintentionally, been sort of kept under the radar in a way. Through an electrokinetic phenomenon termed the Bifield-Brown effect, electrical energy input into asymmetrical capacitors can be converted to mechanical energy, which then provides a force for propelling an object. T.T. Brown, part of the Bifield-Brown effect, co-discoverer, has been issued patent number 2000 or 2949550 and a few other patents for devices based on the utilization of this effect. Townsend's colleague, Banson, who you're going to see is also referenced in this, in the patent itself, has similarly been issued other patents utilizing this effect. NASA is still investigating the use of Brown's discovery, as disclosed in patents 6317310 and among others. There's another such device disclosed, which generates the Bifield-Brown effect using a stacked disk asymmetrical capacitors. And there's ongoing debate in the literature about whether this would work in the vacuum of space. Why is there debate about this? It's because what is claimed when it comes to people who don't think that the Bifield thing novel is that because the experiments are being done in atmosphere, there is something called ion wind, which essentially is a charge of the particles and a actual force being produced, which is pushing. So like the air molecules, for example, getting charged and actually pushing the device upwards. I'm definitely butchering that. And there's a lot of information on it out there in the internet that I would highly recommend people research. But the question is, if you do this in a vacuum, then you don't have those particles that are getting charged, which are actually exhibiting force. And thus, if you were to run this experiment in vacuum, that would showcase that this is not purely an ion wind phenomenon. Perhaps it's something much more. There is in the lore a story that involves T.T. Brown going to Paris, I believe, and actually showcasing his work there in vacuum. And that's all we know about it, at least as far as I'm aware. So this obviously deserves further research, but you have individuals such as James Purvis here, who's doing that research and, has been granted a patent application, and thus I think it lends credence to the probability that there's more to the Bifield-Brown effect than just ion wind. So there is ongoing debate in the literature as to whether this effect will work in vacuum. Another limitation to using the effect may be the scalability potential, since the asymmetrical capacitor devices to date have only generated small amounts of thrust. So we're putting a lot of power in and we're not getting a lot of thrust right now. To be specific, we have this table here. You can take a look at that on your own time. Everything that we're going to cover is, of course, linked in the description of each of these videos. There's various other forms of potential propellantless propulsion. Many of them are listed here. So in summary, this disclosure presents a novel and improved apparatus for electromagnetic spacecraft propulsion, not requiring expendable propulsion or propellant, and only requiring electric power. The basic principle is to produce a current segment, which is not part of a continuous closed circuit. Constant strength magnetic fields from Helmholtz coils, pairs of electromagnetic solenoids act on the current segment. This current segment being in a discharge element, which is a discharge path between two oppositely charged capacitor plates. The field current interactions occur in well-known Lorentz force, Q, V times B, geometric manner as to produce a unidirectional Lorentz force with reaction momentum being carried away by the pointing vector fields in accordance with understood principles. Embodiments of this present invention are novel, that they generate thrust without the use of reaction mass or propellant. So let's pull up the images that we were looking at the beginning and go through the breakdown of the description of each of these. So I'm going to go ahead and get that image. Okay, so these are the images above figure 1, image 1. So let's scroll down. So what is the first image here that we're seeing? Schematic diagram illustrating the unbalanced Lorentz force acting on charged particles moving orthogonally in the same plane. So it is a wire diagram indicating Lorentz force, I suppose, in the leftward direction in this case. Once again, I am just trying to get into this and just trying to bring awareness to these patents. I'm definitely not getting everything correct here. Figure 2. Schematic diagram illustrating the unbalanced Lorentz force on a conductor segment due to a perpendicular magnetic field. Okay, so we have, I'm guessing this potentially is the magnetic field producing component here, perpendicular to perhaps the coil of wire. Not entirely sure. With what's being produced is that vertical force in this case, it seems. Okay, so here we go. So figure 1 is actually this first image. Figure 2 is going to be the result of that being potentially upward thrust, it seems. Figure 3, that is a diagram of essential elements of the best mode of the present invention. So this is an essential element of that invention. 4 and 4b, schematic diagrams illustrating the method of operation of the present invention. So I think this is going back to referring to flipping of the switches. So you can see here that in figure 4a, the switch is in a particular orientation where it's connected to the middle. And in figure 4b, it's connected to the outside. Also, similarly, we have the switches here on the other side. So in the case of figure A, we're completely disconnecting this part of the circuit here. And finally, figure 5, toroidal solenoid embodiment of the present invention. I love that this concept of a toroid keeps coming up. This donut shape seems to have a lot of importance, not just in what we're currently beginning to understand about these possibilities of electrogravitics, but even just if you look down to the symbolism through ancient cultures, there's definitely a consistency of these types of symbols. Think about the infinity symbol as an example. That one has other aspects that are interesting as well. All right, so let's go into PDF. This is the actual patent here. One thing that I want to highlight is that we're citing the reference documents of the work of Brown, the work of Banson, both key players in this history. What's really crucial is having done some research to kind of dig into the history of this field. It really seems like in the early 1900s, there was a real push among the research community, even among popular science, to research new forms of propulsion, principally around something that they were terming anti-gravity at the time, which now has become kind of a soiled word in a way. And people sometimes will say electrogravitics instead. But ultimately, all we're talking about is finding new forms of propulsion or really new forms of understanding physics at the end of the day. And there is a pretty interesting history where around 1957, there was a conference, UNC Chapel Hill, around the role of gravity. And up until that point, you saw a lot of people speaking about this new possibility of anti-gravity. And after that, you really didn't see anything in the literature. No papers were really published about this. And so I think there's a good possibility that a lot of this work was taken underground after that conference and potentially as a result of that conference. We're going to just briefly scroll through a bit of this and then we're going to wrap this up. And what I'll be doing in the future is we're going to cover the other two patents that James Purvis has as well. And ultimately, just want to keep talking about this and bringing light to these topics. And so we're just going to keep doing that until we get somewhere. I think that we need this technology. We need this as a species in order to fundamentally change what we are as a species. And that can be highly positive. It can also be highly negative, just as we've seen with nuclear weapons. So I think that's a big impetus for why this information has been kept secret for so long. It's because it's fundamentally capable of some serious destruction if it's harnessed in the wrong ways. That is definitely a possibility, but as the optimist that I am, I'm going to continue to bring light to these because of the obvious positive implications for people as well. Okay, more about the graphics. I want to note really just Keely, where are we kind of basing this history? Because it's important to understand that this is once again not coming out of thin air. We've got some patent documents, some references. Scrolling down, there's a particular section that I'm looking for. I believe it's at the bottom where it talks about the other patents that kind of led into the discovery or development of this patent. Okay. So we have, once again, just kind of a breakdown. Same thing that we were looking at on Google, just a different format for it right now. So let's actually jump into the detailed description of the preferred embodiment. So that's basically saying how would we in detail prefer to how can you best build out this system? And it's going to be in detail. The present invention now described more fully with references to accompanying drawings. This is the preferred embodiment of the invention. However, it can be embodied in many different ways. So this is just one of many ways to potentially generate such forces. These are provided so that this disclosure will be thorough and complete and will fully cover and convey the scope of the invention to those skilled in this art. That's why there's numbers in the figures. I'm sure somebody a lot more technical than myself with a laboratory could probably take this information and run some experiments. And I highly encourage anybody with those means to do so. By way of further background, the situation presented is well known to those skilled in the art and familiar with the keyworks of Feynman. Figures illustrating two positively charged coplanar particles being parallel on the y-axis of the coordinate system shown. Just going and skimming through some of this. When energized, the coil produces a magnetic field with the strongest vector component along the y-axis, which is the axis of symmetry of the coil. Current segment carrying current 7 is located parallel to the x direction. So I don't really know that I'm doing the best job of breaking this down. I know for a fact that I'm not. But my hope is that once again, we can just make a discussion, keep a discussion going, and potentially even get individuals such as James Purvis to come and give us more information about his process and what the implications of something like this would be. Of course, we never want to jeopardize national security. That's of utmost priority. And we are, at least myself, fundamentally American. And we believe that this is an amazing country. We need to protect it. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be able to talk about important key things, especially when it comes to fundamental new understandings about our world. And once again, that's why I'm trying to do this. All right, so I'm just going to scroll down a bit more. I may not be able to relocate the information that I was hoping to get about where this comes from, but I'm going to try one more time and then we'll wrap it up today. Detailed description of the embodiments, patent citation. Here we go. Okay. So these are citations that are in the patent we're reviewing, basically referencing other patents that led up to this or spurred on this or gave the knowledge necessary for this patent to be actually submitted and validated and granted. So this goes citation wise, this goes all the way back to papers, patents that were essentially put forward as early as 1956. Norman L. Dean, a system for converting rotary motion into unidirectional motion from 1956. 57, electrokinetic apparatus. 1958, another one from Banson, electrical thrust producing device. 1957, electrokinetic transducer, electrical thrust producing device, company Wachovia Bank and Trust, method and apparatus for generating secondary gravitational force fields. Might have to do a whole breakdown on that one. Dipolar force field propulsion systems, electrical propulsion unit for a spacecraft, nonlinear propulsion and energy conversion systems, microwave thruster for a spacecraft. So I mean, this list goes on and on. You can see this is not in isolation. There's a lot here. And as a lot of folks are saying, all that one needs to do is just start to look. And once you see, it's hard to not to see anymore what's actually going on here. So I think we're going to conclude the video with that. And forgive me for my ramblings. This is the first one of this format that I'll be doing, and I'm sure that we'll get better over time. Going to break down in the next video. We're going to cover the we'll go for the electromagnetic segmented capacitor propulsion system, and then we'll finish with the most recent granted patent, which is segmented current magnetic field propulsion. So these all play into one another. But as you can see, it took me a little while to get through this, so we'll do it in a second and third video. And maybe we'll even have some fun with this devices with multiple less lethal selectable options, which is actually pretty sweet. So yeah, links in the description to what we looked at today. And I thank you for taking your time to learn with me.